Hi, my name's Elle, I'm Chair of the Young Liberals, and this is What We Do.
Good evening, conference. Apologies for the technical issues that we had, but we are now ready to start the debate on F21, the policy motion on fixing the ambulance crisis. You'll find that on page 59 of the agenda. There are no amendments, but we have received a request for a separate vote on lines 36 to 41, which is conference calls for 2 and conference calls for 3. FCC has decided to take those separately, so we'll have 2 separate votes at the end on conference calls for 2 and then on conference calls for 3. I now ask Fraser Graham to please stand by, and I call Helen Morgan, our newly elected MP for North Shropshire, to move the motion. Helen.
Good evening, conference. It's an honour to be addressing my first conference as the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for North Shropshire, and I'm afraid also to be demonstrating some of the broadband issues that we face in this rural community. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for helping from the bottom of my heart. To all of you who delivered leaflets, made phone calls, shared tweets and donated time, effort or money, thank you so much. Because of you, I'm already getting to work holding the government to account on a whole host of issues. And it's one of those issues I want to talk about today. As one of my first actions in the House of Commons, I asked Sajid Javid directly whether he would meet with me to discuss the ongoing ambulance crisis in North Shropshire. Conference, it will come to you as no surprise to learn that he refused my request. The Health Secretary's response was emblematic of this government. It failed to understand the problem at hand and willfully ignored anyone who believes it needs addressing. The ambulance crisis, as many of you know, was an issue that came up again and again on the doorstep in North Shropshire as we were campaigning. Tragically, far too many people in my constituency have a personal experience of those delays to share. And since being elected, I've received far too many despairing emails from people who feel powerless as they wait for help. Heartbreaking stories, such as the woman who waited 17 hours in agony with a broken leg on the floor of her care home. Or the schoolboy who got hypothermia after lying on the sports pitch for over 7 hours waiting for help for his dislocated knee. In addition to their injuries, these people and those caring for them experience an enormous amount of distress just waiting for help that should be there quickly. We know that people aren't just waiting for the ambulance to arrive. They're waiting when they get to hospital too. We can see the queues of 11 or 12 ambulances sometimes queued up at my local hospital's A&E. That trust has declared a critical incident on 3 separate occasions in the space of 6 weeks over the winter. But these stories are not unique to Shropshire because this problem is a national crisis and not just a local one. All across the country, long ambulance waiting times are leaving vulnerable patients without the treatment they need. And this is leading to avoidable harm, and in some cases, even avoidable death. This government has run ambulance services into the ground by underfunding and ignoring warnings for too long. West Midlands Ambulance Service even invited Sajid Javid to meet them last winter, in both his capacity as Health Minister, but also as the MP for Bromsgrove, to discuss these issues, but they were ignored. No wonder every single national target has been missed for the most severe cases. I promise that when I was elected, I would make tackling the ambulance crisis one of my top priorities, and that's why I'm bringing this motion forward to conference. This motion offers practical, genuine solutions to the crisis in our ambulance service. Firstly, we're calling for emergency funding to be made available to ambulance trusts across the country to reverse closures of ambulance stations in the community and cancel planned closures where that's needed. Secondly, we're demanding that Sajid Javid commission the Care Quality Commission to conduct an investigation into the causes and impact of ambulance service delays. We cannot entirely know how to solve these problems if we don't specifically know how and why the issues are arising. Thirdly, we want Daisy Cooper MP's ambulance waiting times bill written into law, which would require accessible, localised reports of ambulance response times to be published. Conference, we are Liberal Democrats. We pride ourselves on understanding the need for good data to target sources effectively. How can we identify the areas that need the most support when we only have the data by large regional zones? My constituency in North Shropshire has a completely different set of needs to those of central Birmingham, and yet we only have data for the whole of the West Midlands. and for this reason, I urge you to retain lines 36 to 38. We also know that there are some areas where ambulances service large geographical areas, where a local hub will improve the response time for fairly obvious reasons. And for this reason, I urge you to vote to retain lines 39 to 41. Finally, we must address staffing shortages. All of this would be for naught if the government continues to fail to increase the number of paramedics and ambulance staff. That's why this motion also commits us to pushing for a proper campaign to retain, recruit and train staff across the country. This would relieve pressure on the system and on existing staff and ultimately improve response times and services. If properly implemented, I have no doubt these policies will make a real difference to people's lives and help solve a problem that I'm all too familiar with. Our pledges will help reduce ambulance waiting times. They'll reduce the number of people a year coming to avoidable harm. They will also ease the pressure on the hard-working ambulance teams who are stretched to the limit and working in the most demoralising of conditions. Conference, I urge you to vote for this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. And as Helen said, she is a first-time speaker at conference. So, you can become an MP and still be a first-time speaker. Excellent news. Now, if I can ask Ellen Nicholson to please stand by, and I call Fraser Graham, who is speaking against lines 36 to 38. Fraser.
Good evening, conference. Like many of the speakers here, I agree about the impact that increased ambulance response times have had on members of the public and the need to carry out work to reduce these times. Unfortunately, I disagree with the motion brought here in terms of the bill that Daisy Cooper has moved. And that's why I'm asking you to remove it from the motion. During the first lockdown, I did several shifts as a member of a volunteer ambulance crew with a humanitarian organisation, attending non-urgent calls to support the ambulance service and experiencing firsthand the immense task faced by ambulance crews day in, day out. During that time, it was clear that the service was, and still is, under immense pressure. In particular, dwell times have increased at handover for hospitals, with increased cleaning protocols needed between patients, increasing the downtime between jobs, and breaks often delayed or missed because of the need to keep responding. There is a common misconception that if you call an ambulance for any reason, one will be immediately sent at full speed under blue lights to your location. This simply isn't true for those with non-life-threatening emergencies. Some calls can take time to be responded to because other people simply need help sooner. Another misconception, fueled possibly by hospital TV shows, is that if you arrive at hospital in an ambulance, you'll immediately be blasted through the doors on a trolley, whisked straight into an A&E bed and immediately seen. And that simply isn't true. There is a triage system at A&E, and that's vital to make sure that people are seen based on how urgent their need is. Unfortunately, that can lead to people waiting in ambulances outside hospitals, particularly now when A&E services are too full to accept new non-urgent patients immediately. And that's because of a lack of available A&E capacity. Helen even noted this in her speech, saying that the Trust had declared a critical emergency on several occasions, and that there had often been 11 or 12 ambulances waiting with patients to be seen. None of this would be improved by a bill that instead creates a massive amount of clerical work for control room staff and admin support staff at a time when services are already stretched thin and struggling for funding. I'm welcoming the calls for additional emergency funding for Ambulance Service Trust, but why would that then have to be spent on filling admin roles rather than paramedic roles simply to respond to the other needs in this bill? And also, some of that funding could also go to increase A&E capacity to help actually tackle the situation. I'm hoping you're going to hear from Charlie Hastad, who has some very good points who actually works for an ambulance service, has some very good points to make on this. But simply put, let's actually lay the blame where it is, at the Tories underfunding our NHS, at their Brexit, which has taken out NHS staff, and their attempts to kneecap a vital service, because we all know that what they really want to do in the end is sell it off cheaply to private hands. Let's properly fund our NHS, but please vote to remove those lines. Thank you, conference.
Thank you very much, Fraser. Can I now ask Charlie Hastad to please stand by, and I call Ellen Nicholson to speak in favour of the motion. Ellen.
speak for the motion as a whole and specifically for lines 42 to 43 regarding recruitment and retention of paramedics and other ambulance staff. So I work for the NHS and I work with people who manage ambulance crews as well. So that's my background. And we all know, we've heard so often in various conference motions, the NHS is under pressure. We've said this so often. The ambulance service is under pressure. Helen said this, from North Shropshire to Woking, where I'm a councillor, to Wiltshire, where I've stood as a candidate in the election. Nationally, there are waiting times. They've risen to 6.1 million for our waiting times. And ambulance times for a cardiac arrest are now on average around about 9 minutes. What that means in reality, if we look at British Heart Foundation statistics, British Heart Foundation say around 30,000 out of hospital cardiac arrests happen per year. The survival rate is really low, just 1 in 10. Time really does matter in these instances. And for somebody with a stroke, the average waiting time at the moment is around 42 minutes. Thrombolysis is the most effective medication if started quickly for a stroke. Worryingly, the Journal of Paramedic Practice has surveyed their frontline staff members, and they found that when faced with the record 999 calls, more than half of those NHS staff paramedics are suffering from burnout. And we've heard this across the workforce in the NHS in multiple stories. The high level of burnout is leading some of those staff to quit, which is exacerbating the shortage. And we know that around 16,000 full-time equivalent paramedic staff across England, which isn't that many when you consider how many millions of people they're actually looking for after. We can't afford to lose these staff. A workforce considering leaving, understaffed and stressed, further impacts on those waiting times that we're seeing, making it difficult to attract new recruits into the profession. And all of this impacts on patient safety, which should be at the crux of everything, and our well-being. Please support this motion and help our NHS services, because we never know when we might need them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Can I now please ask Sal Baroness Brinton to please stand by, and I call Charlie Hasted to speak against lines 36 to 41. Charlie.
Hi. So I am a dispatcher for an ambulance service trust, have been for 4 years. To say that people do not blame us for wait times is completely incorrect. I have been threatened with everything from having my throat cut to being raped because people have been waiting for ambulances. Sometimes because I even have the temerity to just ask them for the address where they would like the ambulance sent. Daisy's bill, frankly, looking through it, it doesn't make any sense. It will take hundreds of hours to allocate that, to collate that information and get it out. Postcodes, especially in London where I am, are small. There are how many postcodes in London? I don't even know, but that's how many different reports. 30, 40, 50 different reports my trust has to come up with every month, and then by clinical commissioning group. And then the way it reads, it also wants us to investigate every single time that we've missed a deadline. And again, that's hundreds, thousands of staff hours. And if we are wasting time doing that, then we are not getting out there and responding to calls. It's really simple. Do you want us in a control room doing the admin, or do you want us out there in an ambulance or on the phones taking your calls and responding to them? That's how we're going to cut wait times. Otherwise, you're just giving people another stick to beat us with. It doesn't feel like there's anything in there that's designed to help me do my job with any more efficiency or any quicker. Unless I'm speaking against obviously the extra funding going for ambulance stations, but I'm less concerned about that. I understand people wanting to keep their nearby station open. I completely get it. The reason I'm speaking against it is because, again, ambulances don't sit at station. We're out on the road. We're out. We're at hospital. It makes no difference realistically how close your ambulance station is for most people. But I get it. People like having the knowledge that we're close by. What we need is funding. So to take London, the London Fire Brigade gets 400 million funding. It takes 109,000 calls. The Metropolitan Police gets £3.6 billion of funding, and it takes 4.5 million calls a year. London Ambulance Service gets £440 million of funding, and we take over 2 million calls a year. We are being funded the same as the fire service for a service which is half as busy as the entire Metropolitan Police Service. We need the money. We need to get more people out there working to help you and get you to hospital where you can be supported and treated. That's what we need. We don't need another stick of waiting, of finding out, making pointless reports about why somebody has waited when there is no clinical impact on that patient. We already have a robust reporting service.
Can you draw your remarks to a close, please, Charlie? We already have a robust NHS-wide reporting service that investigates. Okay, I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut it out there, I'm afraid, Charlie, sorry. If I can please ask Heather Kidd to please stand by, and I now call Baroness Brinton to speak in favour of the motion and against the separate votes.
Conference. I want to make it clear that I'm utterly supportive of the ambulance workers, whether they are in the call centre, the dispatchers, people like Charlie, whether they are paramedics actually on the road in the full-time ambulance service, or if they are, like Fraser, volunteers supporting our ambulance service. They do a fantastic job. And we've heard from Helen about the circumstances of how Shropshire was let down by secretive decisions at the top of the ambulance service that left residents without a working service in a very rural area. And we've heard how data is only collected on a regional basis, so it's not possible to see the difference between rural and city targets. I'm sorry, when I say collected, I mean published, because that is why Daisy Cooper's bill is so important. As Charlie said, that data is already collected because you put in postcodes when you take an address. It's automatic. You can easily apply a CCG or in the future an ICB area code on top of that. This isn't going to involve staff doing it. What Daisy's bill says is that it needs to be collected and published in order for not just the secretive people at the top of the ambulance service to decide what to do, but to make sure residents understand that perhaps in urban areas, people are waiting much shorter times than they are in rural services. Lines 39 to 41 say, just like in Shropshire, there should be emergency funding available to reverse the closures of community ambulance services. I'm pleased Charlie isn't against that, but it's really important to understand this is not an eternal keep everything open forever. One of the things that happened in Shropshire and has happened elsewhere in the country is that there has been no local consultation and then services shut. In those circumstances, we say there should be some emergency funding, consultation to go ahead, and if it's appropriate after that and an understanding of why there are cuts, then fair enough, close the service. But I think the problems stem from for us as Liberal Democrats, from two things. The data is collected, Charlie's right, but it's not visible. And in this country where everything seems to be focused very much on cities, the fundamental problem is that our rural services are not getting the ambulance service they deserve. And Fraser, thank you for your contribution. I think it's very hard, though, to take your example of what happened in the pandemic as being right for the long-term future. Most targets were disregarded and have been during the pandemic for exactly the reason that you said. We know that there have been long waiting times. In Cornwall, the Royal Cornwall Hospital, on a number of occasions in the last 3 months, has had more ambulances queuing at A&E than it's had beds in A&E. Not beds free in A&E, beds in A&E. And we believe that accountability and transparency of data is the best way of making sure that everything is properly accountable. So please don't delete these two clauses, clause 2 and clause 3 in clause 4. Vote for the motion as a whole.
Thank you very much, Sal. I now ask Heather Kidd to please come and submit the motion, after which we'll go to a series of 3 votes. Heather.
Thank you. Also coming from Shropshire and having been on health scrutiny for the last 12 years, I can tell you that actually all of that data, as Sal says, is collected. And actually, if you press for it, you can have it. For many, many, many years, in my knowledge, not a single target has ever been met in my division, where I'm a councillor in Shropshire, or in the divisions around me in southwest Shropshire. That data is available. It doesn't have to be done separately. It's just not published. And you have to put a lot of pressure on the ambulance service, especially the West Midlands Ambulance Service, to get it. But not a single target. Whether you've had a stroke or a heart attack, we are lucky if we get an ambulance within 45 minutes. You cannot compare what happens in the urban areas to what happens in the rural areas. The pandemic has just made this slightly worse. But actually for us, we've never had fairness and we've never had fair funding. And Daisy's bill and the whole of this motion actually is vital to make sure that we have fairness across the board. Fraser, it's fine for you to talk about urban areas, but for the rural areas, literally, in my knowledge, nothing has been correct. Nothing has ever worked for us, and the pandemic has now made it worse. I'm grateful for Ellen Nicholson's points around the 9 minutes. I would love a 9 minutes target, or even to be there. I've had stroke victims waiting 4 hours for a target. So if we come to Charlie, the real problem with the ambulance service and actually the health service as a whole is that we've stripped out much of the clerical work. That data is available, and actually if we put more clerics in to do the work, we can have the experts on the ground doing what we need them to do. I actually asked the organiser of the Shropshire Ambulance Service how many ambulances we actually need. And she said 16. How many have they got? 12. They have 16 vehicles. They do not have enough ambulance crews. So all of this motion is vital for all of us across the board. What I would also want is if we have this data published, absolutely, so we can all see, so that no ambulance service can actually average out everything across a huge region and say we're the best because we're doing this, then actually we might get that fairness that we don't have. I urge you all to vote for every part of this motion because it's all vitally important for every area. And so support Helen and support Daisy, please, in this motion. Do not strike out 2 and 3, lines 36 to 38 and 39 to 41. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you very much. So, conference, we now move to a series of 3 votes. The first vote will be separate vote 1, which is to delete conference calls for 1 or to retain conference calls for 1. That vote should be in your polling tab now. We have the results in. 22 people voted in favour of removing Conference Clause 4.2 and 119, apologies, that graphic isn't correct, 119 voted against. That was 22 for, 119 against. Clause 4.2 remains in the motion. We now move to a second vote on Conference Clause 4.3. So again, the option is to either delete or to retain Conference Clause 4.3. That should be open in your voting tabs now. Thank you very much, Conference. The results are in, and 20 people voted in favour of deleting Conference Clause 4.3 and 119 voted against again. So both separate votes have failed. We are now voting on the motion as a whole, unamended. So please vote either in favour or against the motion in your polls tab now. Thank you very much, conference. The votes are in. 142 people voted in favour of the motion and 13 against. So that motion is overwhelmingly carried. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in the debate. We were thankfully able to fit everyone in, which is always good. I'd also like to thank my aide, Cara Jenkinson. We are now about to move to a debate on policy motion F22, Back British Farmers, which will be chaired by Duncan Brack. See you shortly.
Good evening, conference, and we're now moving on to debate item F22, the motion on Back British Farmers. You'll be able to tell that we're running a little bit late, and I've been asked to apologise to all those speakers who've been messed around a bit by technical problems with Skype that were beyond our control. But hopefully it's now all under control and we'll be able to proceed as planned. So you will find the text of the motion on pages 61 to 63 of your agenda. And there is a drafting amendment which we've accepted on page 63A, which is just to update the motion in light of the fact that the New Zealand-UK trade agreement was agreed after the agenda was published and before we got to today. So otherwise there are no amendments or separate votes. It's all fairly straightforward. So could I ask Tim Ashton from North Shropshire to stand by, and now call to move the motion Tim Farron, MP for Westmoreland and Lonsdale, and the party's spokesperson on rural affairs and food.
Tim. Thanks, Duncan. Britain has never needed its farmers more than it does today, and British farmers have never needed a champion more than they do today. And the very simple purpose behind this motion is the Liberal Democrats staking our very bold, very sincere, and very justified claim to being that champion, to being the champion of British farmers, of British farming, and of our landscape. I say we've never needed our farmers as much even as we do today, and I'd say that for three reasons. First of all, our food security. That we only produce roughly 60% of the food that we eat at a time of great international uncertainty, the tragedy and the wickedness of what is going on in Ukraine at the moment is a reminder that we cannot always rely upon imports to be able to feed ourselves. We need to be able to feed ourselves and indeed the animals that many of us also eat. So food security is utterly critical to our national security and our well-being, and indeed to fighting poverty. But it's also, of course, a huge reality that we face a climate emergency, which has not got any better for being off the front pages for the last few weeks. And the farmers that we have in our country are on the front line in the battle against climate change. And we also, of course, have the ongoing need for our farmers because of their centrality to rural communities. Without farmers, the economy of rural communities is hollowed out completely. So we've never needed our farmers more than we do today. And farming has never faced quite so many threats as it does today. Internal threats from a government that takes farming and farming communities for granted, and by accident and by design, seems to be dismantling the British farming industry. And what do I mean by that? Look, even those of us, I'm pretty sure all of us, who were massive enthusiasts for the United Kingdom remaining and indeed one day rejoining the European Union, will surely admit that the Common Agricultural Policy was one of the weak points of membership of the EU. If you were to give us £3.5 billion that we spent on farming through CAP and help us to spend it without EU rules, we could do a far better job. Yes, we could, and the government could, but they're not doing so. They are massively botching the transition from the old system to the new system. The old system, amongst other things, gave farmers what was called the basic payment, the basic payment, the BPS, which made up something like, still makes up something like 85% the profitability of livestock farms. If I tell you that in December just gone, every farm in the country saw a loss in its income through BPS of between 5 and 25%, and the new scheme, let's get acronym heavy now, ELMS, Environmental Land Management Scheme, if I tell you that that scheme is not available yet, and for most farmers it won't be available until 2028 at the earliest, you can see the problem. Our government is expecting British farmers to exist on less and less money without anything new to replace it. Nobody else could survive on that. Why should British farmers? And so British farmers will do one of two things. They'll go bust or they'll go backwards. They'll either go out of business altogether or they'll stop committing to the environmental schemes that we expect them to be drawn into. And that is massively damaging. Of course, the botching of the transition by accident, which I'm going to assume is the case, is also made worse by what the government is doing deliberately. Thanks, I would say, in part to the work of our old friend Lord Goldsmith, Zach Goldsmith. The support of the government for a scheme which will put money into the pockets of wealthy absentee landlords in return for them evicting their farm tenants and then leaving the farm to go to seed, with the farmhouse becoming a second home. That incentive as part of the new package is not accidental. That is a deliberate cleansing of our countryside of hardworking tenant farmers, the scouring from Britain of the tenant farmer class. And what that will mean is the end of the massive reduction, at least, of the British family farm. When people say, and you hear it from all sides, particularly from Conservatives, that British farming is the best, and it is the best, I very rarely get from them any sense of them understanding as to why it is the best. And British farming is the best in the world in terms of quality, in terms of environmental standards, and in terms of animal welfare. Why? Because it is based on the model of the family farm. And the family farm, which brings that attention detail that doesn't come from huge ranch-style farming, that is being scoured out by this botched and indeed deliberately closed transition from the old scheme to the new scheme. Farmers get that, and they need a champion who will speak up for them. But at the same time, we see a government desperate to demonstrate, as it cuts itself off from the big market on our doorstep, new deals with countries that are, in terms of population, to quote Father Ted, small and far away. Those deals with New Zealand and with Australia, countries which we got lots in common with. And of course, we're massively in favour of free trade, essential to liberalism and essential to building peace around the world, that we integrate our economies. But free trade that is not fair trade isn't free at all. And of course, if we're offering a level playing access into our markets to producers overseas that have far worse standards on animal welfare and on environment, and therefore cheaper production costs, we are undercutting and undermining our farmers and undermining our high standards, all being done in the name of this government being able to demonstrate some kind of post-Brexit wins. And then there's the issue of climate change, the all-encompassing greatest threat that we face as a species. And I want to say this to you very clearly. All the best environmental plans in the world will achieve nothing if there's no one out there to stand forward for them and to deliver them. And we need, with 70% of England's land being agricultural, we need farmers if we're going to deliver those environmental policies. Otherwise, they're just great ideas in a drawer. And so we want to be, and today we demand, if you like, the role of champion of British farmers, because there needs to be a champion of British farmers. We understand farming, we care for it. In an electoral system like we've got, it breeds two-horse races. And I'm determined that we are the other horse in rural Britain. One horse owns rural Britain, the other horse stands for rural Britain, understands its needs, its issues, and will champion them. Let's today, the Liberal Democrats, determine to be the voice of rural Britain, the voice of Britain's farmers, just at the moment when they need that voice the most.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. Would Jacqueline Bell from Edinburgh North, East and Leith please stand by? And now called to speak in favour of the motion, Tim Ashton from North Shropshire. Tim.
Good evening, can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me?
We can, go ahead.
Okay, great. Yes. I just want to introduce myself briefly before I say a few words, and I want to associate myself fully with all of what Tim, who preceded me, other Tim, just said. I'm aware I have about 3 minutes. I'm not entirely sure I use all of them, but I farm in North Shropshire, and many of you might have been to my house because it was the campaign headquarters that Helen Morgan used to get her historic win. And I wanted to say a few things about how, on a pragmatic level, it's just very sensible politics for the Liberal Democrats to go into the vacuum of proper representation for rural communities that are crying out for better representation for all of the reasons that Tim just set out. There are lots of places like North Shropshire, and farmers are extremely anxious at the moment, and there's a large appetite to refresh how their reputation operates on the basis of what happened in North Shropshire. I'm aware personally that there's an appetite for it in Lincolnshire, the Cotswolds, the south of Shropshire. Just from my personal network, that people are extremely concerned and exasperated by the current direction of public policy as it relates to farmers. So there is a space for the party to step into, and it's not only sort of pragmatic politics, but also for the climate change reasons and the strategic reasons that Tim was setting out, a moral obligation on the party to fill a void which has been left by the governing party. One sort of personal observation I would like to make is that I often find a tension that doesn't need to necessarily exist between environmentalists and farmers. George Monbiot's next book has a chapter on it about work I've been doing on the farm here. And I think it's really, really important that we try and create an environment where environmentalists realise that farmers sit on the same side of the table, facing the same direction, with many of the same concerns. And we need to try and iron out a degree of antagonism between those two constituencies of opinion. And on a personal level, I would like to propose that if a pathway could be found for doing this, that a policy workshop at a rural university, perhaps Harper Adams, is convened to deal with what is essentially quite an urgent crisis in public policy. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to say that the party needs to be not only the champion of British farmers, but to be seen to be doing it. So we need to put some action behind what we're saying. Those are my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for your first speech to party conference. Could Ellen Nicholson from Woking please stand by? And now call to speak in favour of the motion, Jackie Bell from North Edinburgh, East and Leith. Jackie.
Conference. Farming in Britain has formed our landscape over millennia. My family has farmed for centuries on the North York moors, so I know the hardships of hill farming. I'm a community councillor, area partnership chair, and now council candidate for a large rural ward that was once at the forefront of the Scottish agricultural revolution. Dunbar also has a historic fishing industry. Farming's faced challenges. Foot and mouth was devastating, but farmers bounced back. They learned to diversify. Dairy farming family became renowned cheesemakers. EU membership ensured high animal welfare and food quality standards. It ensures speedy travel for Dunbar shellfish to Europe and market for other produce like cheese, beer, cider. Brexit was a shot in the mouth moment for many British farmers, including family who voted for it. It's harder to trade with Europe. Export costs for produce have increased. Markets for shellfish reduced due to red tape, slowing movement of produce that the market wants alive. The cost of producing British food has increased with retail prices rising. Consumers may opt for cheaper foreign imports. The British food produced to higher standards. The Australian and New Zealand trade agreements further threaten the well-being of British farms, farming families and rural communities. It may be that lamb produced on my niece's farm in New Zealand undercuts the prices of that produced by her dad in Yorkshire or sister in Berwickshire. Additionally, trade deals with Australia and New Zealand have implications for climate change. The distances involved, transport by ship or air, need for refrigeration, they all add to food miles, far in excess of that of British food. And their glee to announce these far-flung deals, the government seemed to forget COP and promises to reduce carbon footprints. Conference, we need to support our food producers. If we do not, the landscape they have nurtured for so long is at risk because significant numbers of them may find it too unprofitable to continue. And that also damages, as Tim said, our food security. Conference, please support the motion and back our British farmers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Would Rob Harrison from Liberal Democrats in Europe please stand by? And I'll call to speak in favour of the motion, Ellen Nicholson from Woking. Ellen.
Thank you. Conference, I'd like to support the motion as a whole. I grew up in a rural farming community, working weekends and evenings on a farm. In 2019, in the general election, I was the parliamentary candidate for a rural constituency in Wiltshire, and I remain the spokesperson there as well. Our farming communities from North Shropshire to Wiltshire, they're very similar with the issues that they have. Farming in Britain has been directly impacted by Brexit, by climate change, by COVID-19, and now our food security is threatened globally by the war in the Ukraine. The Economist today reported that 29% of the wheat production is from Russia and the Ukraine, and that will obviously be impacted by this war. None of the post-Brexit trade deals should adversely affect or undermine our farmers. Indeed, the National Farmers Union said in February that any new trade deals should not undermine British farming by allowing imports of food produced using methods that are illegal here. We don't want to undermine the standards that we have. British food is produced to some of the highest welfare standards, as we heard Tim say, in the world. And our farmers are committed to reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions. British farmers enhance the countryside, they maintain our habitat for the native plants and animals, and they maintain many of the public footpaths that we use. as well as protecting our watercourses and supporting our wildlife. They're essential to what we have in our countryside and our country. Nothing operates in isolation. The impact of our food markets and our farmers impacts on our workers, our factories, to our shop floors, to our tables, and it also impacts on our health. Please support this motion to support our farmers, our future food security and our future health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Could I ask Helen Walker from North Devon to stand by? I now call to speak against the motion, and particularly against lines 15 to 18, Rob Harrison from Liberal Democrats in Europe. Rob.
Thank you very much indeed, Duncan, and good evening, conference. 100 years ago, or just over 100 years ago, my grandfather emigrated from North London down to Queensland. He only returned twice during that time, once in 1914 and once after the death of his parents, my great-grandparents, at the late 1940s. In the 20s and 30s, he farmed up in central Queensland in the Darling Downs, raising cattle on a cattle farm, later starting up a tobacco farm, believe it or not, in Australia. Yes, he did use somewhat traditional methods, as we might like to call it these days, methods that would no longer be used in the United Kingdom. These practices have long been banned, mostly through European Union legislation, initiated in many, many cases by farmers, by animal welfare activists in the United Kingdom, which were able to extend it around. And so it's a disappointment to see how this is being retrograded in the past few years because of some extreme free traders here. Tim's right. We want to see free trade, but it has to be fair trade. But one of the things I don't like about this motion is the way that it bashes Australia's farmers here. Yes, it is certainly true that some Australian farming methods include hormones, antibiotics and pesticides that would be banned in the United Kingdom. The conference, there is a large and growing body of farmers in Australia who are rejecting these methods. Sure, they're not supported by the so-called Liberal Party of Australia. They're supported by the Green Party of Australia, of which a number of my relatives are active in. And yes, they are desperately trying to make certain that Australian farming standards improve massively, because they know that is the only way in which we can secure a good, environmentally sound food supply. And so I deeply regret that we felt it necessary in section A here to actually criticise Australian farmers in such a manner. Yes, conference, we really do want to back British farmers, but we shouldn't be bashing Australian farmers at the same time. We should be using fair trade deals to encourage good farming practices throughout the world. Thanks very much indeed, conference.
Thank you, Rob. Could I ask Fiona Hornby from Devices to stand by? And now call to speak in favour of the motion, Helen Walker from North Devon. Helen.
Conference. I'm a district councillor and I live in North Devon, a rural, largely farming-based constituency. Our farmers produce high-quality produce conforming to all the current UK standards. They actively preserve rare breeds such as the Tamworth and Gloucester Old Spot pigs, along with our distinctive ruby red cattle. With rare breed poultry, we have farms that specialise in them, selling them to commercial producers and garden farmers alike. Unlike bringing produce in from countries such as Australia and New Zealand, buying British does not produce the food miles that are causing the destruction of our environment. I'm lucky. My meat is produced and sold locally, and I can buy produce grown 4 miles away. I'm aware not everyone can reduce their food miles that much. Climate change is a huge worry to our farmers, as more rainfall means that they must overwinter animals in shelters and provide more feed. They are painted as the villains causing climate change, but if done right, UK farming will be part of the answer to climate and ecological emergencies. Schemes that are being investigated include using animal waste to create methane to run refuse trucks, planting hedges and woodland to store carbon, and working with the renewables sector. The Australian and New Zealand deals and future deals like it would mean that British farmers would not be able to work in helping with the climate change emergency, as they would not be making the money that these schemes require. And although the government has stated that there will be allowances available to do this, the farmers do not know when this would start. There is no provision in the Australian deal to meet climate change commitments, especially our obligations to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. Farmers locally are worried about the impact of these deals, especially as they see more red tape being applied to their businesses, including the Red Tractor scheme, as well as financial uncertainty. They believe the 2020 Agriculture Act contains no coherent plans to replace the EU subsidies. We do not need to set the precedent that the Australian and New Zealand deals would. We need to produce more good quality food in this country or face losing our farming communities. Conference, I urge you to support this motion.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. Could I ask Phil Benyon from Lichfield, Tamworth and Burton to stand by? And now called to speak in favour of the motion, Fiona Hornby from Devizes. Fiona.
Good evening, Conference. The motion is entitled Back British Farmers. At a time like this, when the conflict in Ukraine threatens food security around the world, we need to do just that. And as has been said by many previous speakers, British farmers produce good food. The motion talks about the lower animal welfare and environmental standards in Australia. But let's be blunt. We know that this is just the starter, and what this government is aiming for is a deal like this for America. But it doesn't talk about why these standards are so important. One of the supposed benefits of Brexit sold to the British public was cheaper food. But at what price? If you can afford to eat only organic food, then legislation about standards doesn't really matter. But if you can't, and that is the majority, those standards protect you from buying potentially harmful products. Allowing lower standards in sends us back on the road to Victorian flour with its chalk and alum and the consequential health problems. Only this time, there'll be antibiotic resistance and hormone disruptors. Keeping the standards that we agreed as members of the EU also helps to keep open the option of repairing our relationship with the EU, just as we discussed this morning. Putting our farmers out of business because their products are being undercut by cheap imports does nothing for our food security, which requires as much self-sufficiency as possible in food production. Like so much else this government has proposed since Brexit, many of the ELM schemes in their outline have a sort of one-size-fits-all attitude or flavour. We can't go down this road. Farming is a very diverse activity. Here in Wiltshire, in the last 20 years, I've seen the local farms harvest vary from late July to the last weeks of September. You cannot order how these things are going to be done. Farming is an activity which you can't always predict the outcomes. And this government just wants us to be like big businesses where they can say, put this in and this is what will come out. Please support the motion, but also ask for more, because we really do need to support British farming.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Could I ask Liz Webster from North Wiltshire to stand by? And now called to speak in favour of the motion, Phil Benyon from Lichfield, Tamworth and Burton. Phil.
Thank you, Duncan. Firstly, I probably ought to declare an interest, being still a working farmer on a sort of family-sized farm, 260 acres. Now, when I was when I was campaigning against Brexit, I actually cut a video on Westminster Green where I described the effect of Brexit on farming, or the potential effect of Brexit on farming, as a triple whammy. Firstly, Brexit was going to reduce our access to our main export market in the European Union, and that has been completely borne out by the government's obsession with a very hard Brexit, which has left farmers with all sorts of hoops to jump through to get anything into our main export market. The second point I made was that we would also lose our payments from the European Union, and they would not be replaced with income-bearing payments from the Tory government that has always wanted to get rid of the payments while we were in the EU. And again, the ELM scheme, which we see before us, is incoherent. And others have pointed out that the way that the ELM scheme has been put forward, the World Trade Organization rules actually preclude any income-bearing payments coming from environmental schemes. This goes all the way back to the GATT Agreement of 1993. And there is no food security element or income-bearing element in the ELM scheme. And Tim has already pointed out that we rely on the payments for about 75 to 85% of our income. So if you actually look at what the effect of this is going to be, it is going to mean a massive demanning of agriculture, which will lead to there being too few farmers on the land to actually deliver the schemes. And the third point, of course, of my triple whammy was opening up British agriculture to products from all around the world which don't have to meet the same standards. And one particular example of this, I'll give you an example, some work's been done. Pig production in the United States under their regulations is 30% cheaper than pig production under our regulations. So there we have it, triple whammy. It makes farming in the UK unviable on an economic basis. So we have to actually do something about this. When I was in North Shropshire, I can back up Tim that the farmers there are absolutely fed up with the government because the government has no understanding of the need to make an income out of farming. And this is a devastating government for farmers, and that's why they're moving to us. So please back this motion all the way. Thanks. And thanks for Tim, and thanks to the other speakers for such good points.
Thank you very much, Phil. Would David Chalmers from North Devon please stand by, and I'll call to speak in favour of the motion Liz Webster from North Wiltshire. Liz.
Good evening, conference. Great to see you all. Yes, I am a farmer too. I also run a campaign group called Save British Farming. There is a huge disconnect between the rural and urban communities in Britain, and it's basically thanks to history. In 1846, the Liberal Party released the people from the cruel feudal system by repealing the Corn Laws, which levelled up the bottom 90% and it levelled down the top 10%. As the people moved off the land, the empire fed us and British agriculture went into a deep recession. But 2 world wars exposed our weakness as German U-boats targeted our food supplies in an attempt to starve us into submission. Lessons learnt from the war, particularly on food security, provided the strongest argument for joining the EU. EU membership has brought us incentivised food production and a huge efficient market with friction-free borders. This has disconnected consumers, and I'm including many of you in this, from the realities of how farming produces the food they consume. Food has become plentiful, varied, and a lot cheaper. So the security of that food supply has ensured consumers can make demands on the food standards. Now, this system has ensured that there's only around 120,000 farmers in Britain now. The holding sizes have increased. And the food and drink industry, however, is actually one of the biggest manufacturing sectors in this country, with a turnover of about £100 billion a year. Many people tend to think that food comes from the supermarkets, but food comes from farms. It's not a luxury pastime for the landed gentry. There are wealthy farmers, but there's also lots of poor farmers or not so wealthy farmers. So after decades of peace, we've now got war. And once again, we are seeing history repeat itself. The Ukraine and Russia are the heart and lungs of the global food system. It is now an emergency for Britain. Domestic food production is shrinking, is being ravaged by Brexit and the lunacy of this ideology of this far-right government. The approach of this government to our system, to our food system, is the height of irresponsibility. A hurricane is headed our way, and they've left all our windows and doors wide open. This government are lost in their neoliberal ideology, believing that the world markets will always be able to feed us, and they are wrong. So, conference, please, don't just back this motion, back our farmers and understand why it impacts you as a consumer and your food, your diet, your health and your environment. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. Could I ask Helen Morgan from North Shropshire to stand by? And I now call to speak in favour of the motion, David Chalmers from North Devon. David.
Thank you, Duncan. Good evening, conference. I asked you to support this motion and show that we Lib Dems are backing Britain's farmers. I'm calling you tonight from deepest rural Devon, surrounded by farms. In fact, I now live on a working one, with a gale blowing in off the Atlantic. So if I get cut off, you know why. It feels symbolic. A farmer is not an easy life at the best of times. And as this motion describes, certainly not in these uncertain ones. I stood in the past two general elections in Torridge and West Devon, one of the most rural constituencies in the country. And in 2019, that bleak December, I spoke at the regional NFU hustings. I was a bit wary, to say the least, looking out at a sea of tweed at how I was going to be received. After I had spoken and warned that if we were to leave the EU with no deal, British farmers would find it difficult to sell their produce to their markets across Europe, that whatever scheme the Tories came up with to replace the cap would not match what they received already, and that any future trade deal, at the time we thought the first one might be with Trump's America, that it would be British farming that would be given up to save other industries. The farmers really listened. And after I'd spoken, one of them stood up and said, David, we hear what you're saying, but if what you predict comes true, it will be such a disaster for British farming that we might as well pack up. Well, what we predicted has come true, just about, except that the first trade deals are now with Australia and New Zealand. The Tories are selling our farmers down the river. They are not going to be able to compete with the cheap imports reared under less strict controls. They've been virtually cut off from their main European markets, and as the cap payments are phased out, the elms are unlikely to come alive for several years. Farmers may only constitute a small percentage of the population in our rural communities, but they are key and hugely influential. You only need to look at the billboards in elections, and they are worried. We need to show them that as a party, we are listening to their concerns. You heard this morning in the European debate that how we consulted with our members across the country in a series of events, which the Liberal Democrat European group hosted, that highlighted genuine concerns and heard anecdotal stories from members on how Brexit is having an impact. Well, we're carrying the programme forward this year. On the 11th of May, we're hosting a conference on agriculture, how Brexit is impacting British farming. We aim to find further policies like today's to show we have farmers' backs. We proved that we can do it in North Shropshire, and I tell you that a number of our rural constituencies in the southwest, which we were told were unwinnable because they voted Leave, like my own here in North Devon, well, let's say they are back in play. Please vote for this motion and let's send a message to British farmers in this time of uncertainty, when more than ever we need to ensure our food security, that we can feed ourselves, that we have their backs. And let's make North Shropshire the first of many wins in rural constituencies across the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Our final speaker to summate on the motion needs no introduction. Helen Morgan, MP for North Shropshire.
Good evening once again, conference. And thank you for having me back after my broadband issues. British farmers need our help. The Conservative government has taken them for granted and left many family farmers facing financial ruin. During the by-election, I heard story after story from farmers who'd been desperately let down by this out-of-touch Conservative government. For example, a sheep farmer who was unable to export his breeding ewes to Europe because Parliament did not get the chance to scrutinise the trade deal with the EU and ensure that our farmers were on a level playing field in this biggest market. I've met pig farmers who are being undercut by foreign imports, the animals being reared to lower standards than in the UK. The Australia and New Zealand trade deals threaten to make these situations much worse, with more and more farmers seeing their high-quality produce undercut with cheaper imports. These farmers have told me they feel like expendable bargaining chips. These farmers feel as though their livelihoods are being thrown under a bus, so the Conservatives can just say they've sealed a trade deal, and one with minimal benefit to the Britain at that. A couple of weeks ago, I met an arable farmer whose family farm on a floodplain. They're using novel planting techniques to ensure that there is grass cover during times of flood, preventing the soil from washing away downstream. But they've no idea whether that will be reimbursed under the Environmental Land Management or ELM scheme, because this scheme hasn't been fully thought out or communicated to the farmers who are going to be using it. Their basic farm payments are being phased out before the scheme is ready. They can't plan for the future, and their input costs, from diesel to fertiliser and animal feed, are going through the roof. Farm incomes hit a 10-year low in Shropshire last year, and that's before the basic farm payment was cut. They just can't afford this uncaring and incompetent government. The Liberal Democrat message to farmers is clear. We are on your side. We back British farming. This motion, if passed, would protect farmers from the disastrous aspects of the UK, Australia and New Zealand trade deals or any future trade deals. Of course, this country can do better on environmental and animal welfare standards, but we do lead the world at the moment and we can continue to do so, but only if our farmers are still in business. Failing to protect them just offshores the problem to places where we can't see the issues and let alone control them. And that's before you start to factor in the problem of food miles. We need our farmers to be in business to do our bit for the environment. Crucially, this motion would also end the phase out of current farm payments until the new ELM schemes is fully ready. It would ensure smaller family farms can continue and prevent them from being swallowed up by large commercial entities or absentee landlords, as Tim described as he moved this motion. Without our family farms, the British countryside would look very different, and British consumers would have less control over their carbon footprint and the quality of the food they put on their tables. And tenant families who farmed the land for generations and supported their communities would be removed. That's before we get to the tragic events of the last couple of weeks, which have shown us that more than ever, we need to produce our food at home for our own security. All of these wonderful speeches this evening have proved that this party stands firmly shoulder to shoulder with British farmers. They define our countryside, they glue our rural communities together, and they need and they deserve our support. Conference, I urge you to vote for this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. We're now moving to a vote, a conference on motion F22, simple for or against. So you have 2 minutes to cast your vote in the voting tab to the right of your screen on computers or the bar charts icon on a tablet. So please cast your vote for or against motion F22 now. Thank you very much, Conference. That motion is very clearly carried by 197 votes in favour to 8 against. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to my aides, Belinda Brooks-Gordon and Cara Jenkinson. Thank you very much to the technical team who make online conferences possible. And thank you all, Conference. I'm now handing over to Jenny Rigg for item F23.
Hi, my name's Elle, I'm Chair of the Young Liberals, and this is what we do.
Good evening, Conference, and welcome to F23, Swift Justice for Victims and Offenders, which you will find on page 64 of the agenda. There is one amendment, which is on page 66A of the dynamically updated online agenda, and I am aware that we're running a little bit late, so can I please remind all speakers to keep to time? I now ask James Bailey from Breckland to stand by and call Vera Hobhouse, who is our MP for Bath and North East Somerset, and she's going to propose the motion for us. Vera.
Good evening, Conference. Thank you for everybody still being here on a Saturday night, but it is a very important issue that we are going to discuss in the next half an hour. A robust, well-functioning justice system is a cornerstone of our democracy. This Conservative government has entirely failed to get to grips with a huge backlog in our criminal courts. The number of outstanding criminal cases has reached almost 60,000. 13,000 cases are more than a year old. Court backlogs have caused the number of people held in prisons on remand to rise by 48%. The current crisis is the greatest threat to the proper operation of our criminal justice system. Conference. Justice delayed is justice denied. The average court case now takes 23 months from offence to completion, 2 years of waiting for a victim or family to get the justice they need, 2 years of reliving the trauma, 2 years before victims can move on with their lives. For an innocent defendant, it could mean 2 years of life in limbo. This is simply unacceptable. The government says it will reduce the Crown Court backlog to 53,000 by March 2025. This isn't good enough. It would leave the backlog nearly 60% larger than it was at the end of 2018. The government's failure is undermining public confidence, letting down court staff, judges, and lawyers. No wonder that the criminal justice system is facing a workforce crisis. The number of full practice barristers has fallen by 11% since 2016. The permanent court staff has shrunk by 20% since 2015. And there aren't enough judges. The Law Society says British justice will cease to exist without a healthy criminal defence profession. And it is the public who will suffer. The longer it goes on, the more victims will suffer while criminals get away with it. We need urgent action. This motion proposes 6 policies that will help reduce the backlog in our courts. Extra Nightingale courts to increase capacity. A workforce strategy to ensure there are enough criminal barristers. A new database to ensure capacity meets demand and to understand the needs of all users, especially victims, vulnerable people, and those from ethnic minority backgrounds. Extra funding for victim services. And any rejection to weaken the right to trial by jury. We are also fighting to restore community courts buildings and reduce the number of people in prison on remand. Last but not least, we need a simpler and more generous legal aid system. Conference, we have got one amendment. I'm looking forward to a lively debate, and I hope that you all understand the urgency while we need action now, and we Liberal Democrats are prepared to make constructive proposals of how we can get to grips with the very serious backlog in our courts. Please support the motion.
Thank you very much, Vera. Can I ask Dina Romero from Bath and North East Somerset to stand by? And I now call James Bailey from Breckland, who is going to be proposing the amendments. James.
Thank you, Jenny. This amendment adds essentially a 7th pillar to the 6 that Vera just laid out around restorative justice. That's the process of providing justice via essentially a mediated, facilitated discussion between victims and offenders. This is something that we already do to a certain extent in the UK, alongside the current procedural system. It's something that works very well, but is grossly underused. Satisfaction from victims in restorative justice systems in the UK is at 85%. It's been shown to cut reoffending rates, and yet it is only offered in about 5% of criminal cases in the UK. The amendment we've proposed moves the Liberal Democrats' policy forward on this area in 2 important ways. Firstly, it recognises for the first time that there should be potential in certain cases for restorative justice to be used separately to, rather than as an add-on to, procedural justice. That is, for certain things, it might be appropriate to simply use the restorative justice system on its own, which would reduce burdens elsewhere, and also changes incentives. So, for example, because offenders tend to have more incentive to participate in restorative justice, it often stops them for cases like, for example, vandalism, dragging victims through a long process where they have every incentive to deny what happened to begin with. The second point is that we provide in this amendment for systems to refer directly to restorative justice systems from, for example, local authorities, rather than this only being available through the police. Again, this would help reduce strain on the police, particularly for certain sorts of low-level crime. and as well, it would potentially provide access to justice for people in communities with very low levels of trust in the police. So these systems would allow restorative justice a much bigger place in our process. It's a profoundly liberal idea and gives us a more unique selling point on the justice system. So please back our amendment and back the motion as a whole. Thank you very much, conference.
Thank you, James. Can I ask Janie Little to please stand by? And I now call Dina Romero from Bath and North East Somerset, who wishes to speak in favour of the motion. Dina.
Thank you. Yes, it feels very much like it's the Bath and North East Somerset show, doesn't it? So I'm a local councillor in Bath and North East Somerset, and I have been for nearly 19 years. And I've been contacted perhaps more times than you might expect by residents who are concerned about the length of time that it takes for a case to go through the full process of the legal system to bring about justice and closure for the victim. I think this somewhat proves that the problems with the system are long-standing and are not the result of the pandemic, although without doubt the pandemic has exacerbated the issues. These are well-known delays, and these delays dissuade victims from coming forward. And when there is a lack of substantiated evidence from victims, this often itself leads to crimes not being pursued and the perpetrators then not being brought to justice. As line 36 in the motion puts it very well, justice delayed is justice denied. We need residents to have faith in the justice system. We want victims to feel supported and for criminals to understand that the legal system is not something to be trifled with. Critical to this is funding to ensure that the system is fit for purpose, properly staffed at every level with victim support available to all, and that the buildings where justice is dispensed from are in the right location for the communities they serve. This might mean reopening buildings or building new facilities, as well as investing in legal aid, so that right to justice is not just the province of the rich. We should demand that government does deliver something that is world-beating, a legal system that can be respected across the globe, but more importantly, serves the people of the UK entirely properly. I urge you all to support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dina. Can I ask Lord Jonathan Marks to please stand by? And I now call Jenny Little, who is the Young Liberals Policy Officer, and she is going to speak in favour of the amendment. Janie.
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to thank everyone who worked on this motion, which commits us to going some way to fixing the broken justice system and also to tackling the failures of this Conservative government. I'd also like to thank James for all of his work on this amendment and for sort of chatting to me and working with me throughout the process. Government research shows that restorative justice approaches reduce reoffending by 14%. It works, and that saves the criminal justice system money. And sort of as James outlined earlier, victim satisfaction is at 85%. The evidence shows that it's an incredibly effective process, and therefore it only makes sense to expand it, as James has outlined. As Liberal Democrats, we are about evidence-based policy. That's what we want, and that's what this amendment is. It's about empowering these processes, which have been proven to be highly effective, and providing alternative routes for these to be accessed, lessening the burden on our police. I think that the point about inclusivity and sort of opening up these processes to people who perhaps have lower trust in the police is a really salient one, because there's a lot to be done about police trust, and it's not an easy issue at all. So any new routes that we can have so that victims can get what they deserve is absolutely worth us committing ourselves to. Restorative justice approaches are just massively underutilised, but they can provide immense benefit, and so it's just logical to expand them. Restoration and rehabilitation are a distinctly liberal and compassionate approach to justice. That's what our party's about. And so it's right that we commit ourselves to this more extensively and just to make sure that sort of we're really ahead of the game on this issue. I'll end there by reiterating my thanks to James for writing and submitting this amendment, and I encourage conference to vote for both the amendment and for the motion as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janie. After Lord Marks has spoken, we are going to have a pair of votes, but for now, I would like to ask Lord Jonathan Marks to summate on the motion, please. Jonathan.
Conference, this motion may seem like a lawyer's motion, and certainly lawyers see firsthand the dreadful effect of criminal court delays. But this motion affects us all. We're all invested in our criminal justice system, and we neglect it at our peril. Yet the Prime Minister and his henchman Deputy Dominic Raab talk the talk about making Britain's streets safer, while allowing our justice system to wither on the vine. They may blame it all on COVID, and yes, COVID made the delays much worse, but so much more could have been done, and much more must be done now. They cannot hide from the facts. The backlog went up by 23% in the year before the pandemic, yet they won't fund the extra Nightingale courts needed to cut it. There just is no excuse for cases which are ready for trial, waiting for months or years for dates to be fixed. And cases should be prepared for trial at an acceptable rate, not so fast the corners are cut, but not frustrated by these endless delays endemic in a resource-starved system suspended in a permanent state of chaos and crisis. Yet now that the pandemic has been declared officially over by a Prime Minister desperate to rebuild his shattered reputation, we were told last week that nearly half of the Nightingale courts are to be closed. 11 courts across the country, from Winchester to Manchester, will shut within weeks, and another 12 within a year. And that's despite a backlog of 59,000 odd cases against a pre-pandemic figure of 41,000, itself both a record and a disgrace. All this is against a background of a service so demoralised that criminal barristers are leaving the bar at unprecedented rates, at a time of increasing demand. Criminal solicitors are in trouble, court staff are resigning, and the CPS is overwhelmed by its workload. Stephanie Boyce, the president of the Law Society, complains of a lack of judges, court staff, prosecutors, and defence lawyers, stretching the system to breaking point. Yet the MOJ, with mind-numbing complacency, says there's no evidence that barrister numbers are affecting the backlog. So as Dina said, victims wait literally for years to see perpetrators brought to court, and so many withdraw from prosecutions, believing they'll never see justice done. This has contributed to the appallingly low number of rape convictions and convictions for other offences against women and girls, as victims have become discouraged from pressing cases for trial. Meanwhile, unconvicted defendants are kept waiting far too long for their trials, many in custody. We've seen a shocking increase in the number of defendants in custody on remand, as Vera reminded us, nearly 50% in the 3 years to last September, and in the time they've spent in custody without trial. And many of them don't end up getting a custodial sentence. And the government's plan? Well, there's renewed sniping at jury trial, one of our fundamental rights, which the government claims to want in their new Bill of Rights, and a fig leaf proposal to increase magistrate sentences for single offences from 6 to 12 months, an illiberal measure with an entirely unpredictable outcome. Conference, we value our criminal justice system, but if we want to save it for the future, we have to fund it now. We have to make it work, and that means bringing on trials in reasonable time. It also means increasing and supporting restorative justice, and so we back the amendment James proposed, ably supported by Jamie. This motion conference sets out a programme towards recovery for our criminal justice system. Please support it.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So we now move to a pair of votes. Firstly, we will be voting on whether or not to accept Amendment 1. You will find the votes as usual in the polls tab on your computer or under the little picture of a bar chart if you're using the app. Thank you, conference. We now have the result of that vote, and there are 173 votes in favour of the amendment and only 7 against, so that is very clearly carried. We now move to a vote on the motion as a whole, and as before, you will find it in the polls tab or under the little picture of a bar chart. Thank you very much. Thank you, conference. We now have the result of the vote on the motion as amended, and it's 172 votes in favour and only 2 against, so that's very clearly carried. I would like to thank all the people who spoke in that motion for being admirably succinct. We have caught up a little time. I'd like to thank my aides, Bex Scott and Cara Jenkinson. And I'd like to thank the technical people who have made all this possible and protected us from the baby sharks. I now hand over to John Ball, who's going to be chairing the next session.
Good evening, conference, and welcome to F24, the policy debate on democracy and public debate. The motion starts on page 67 of the agenda. Speakers may also refer to policy paper 145, which is available as a separate document on the website. There are no moved amendments to this motion. However, FCC has accepted a drafting amendment to correct Post Office to Royal Mail in line 76. And there will be a separate vote on lines 84 and 85. There's also been a request for a reference back, which I'll take towards the end of the debate, and I'll explain that when we come to it. Will speakers please stick to time, as I've received more cards than we'll have time to call. Will Andrew Emerson please stand by, and I now call Dr. Christine Cheng to move the motion.
Good evening, conference. Tonight's motion is about how we talk to each other across political boundaries. It's about protecting our political information space and our right as citizens to engage in politics, online and offline, without fear or harm being done to us. Most of the time, we're lucky enough to take this space for granted, but the advent of social media has overturned the space for political debate in many unexpected ways. We can see from the war in Ukraine how important it is to protect our democracy from the poison of disinformation. It's clear we need new tools and a new approach. Since 2016, through the Brexit campaign and Trump's election, we've seen how fake news has sown the seeds of division and polarization in democracies all over the world. As a result, we no longer trust the news the way we used to. And this mistrust of our political information space has fueled a more general distrust of politics and of politicians. When our political debate space grows confusing, nasty, and loud, people don't know what to believe anymore, so they tune out, they disengage. But democracy falters when so many of us withdraw. So we must restore the conditions for civil debate. We need to create the space to disagree and to disagree well. Our conservative friends see things differently. The more libertarian ones will argue that freedom of speech should have no limits, even if it means abusing others and spreading harmful misinformation. At the other extreme, the same Tory party is pushing through legislation that limits our right to public protest. Meanwhile, the Labour Party just can't seem to decide where it stands on civil liberties. Conference, we presented this motion to you at Autumn Conference and it was referred back. Since then, the Policy Working Group has worked closely with James Bailey to address the concerns raised in the autumn debate and to strengthen both the paper and the motion. A key issue that needed clarification was to define who these policies were aimed at on the social media side. Many of you were rightly concerned that smaller companies or social forums would be hampered by these rules, and we responded by separating out very large online platforms, those with 10% of the UK population as registered users, from small and medium platforms. We also provided a more extensive definition for algorithms and incorporated language so that we will stay aligned with EU regulations. Conference, the heart of this motion is about creating a healthy sphere for public political debate, a space where citizens can engage freely, online and offline, without fear or harm being done to us. We envision an information ecosystem space where facts matter, where journalists are paid for their content, where local and regional news outlets can thrive, where public spaces offer free Wi-Fi as a matter of course, and where large social media companies like Facebook and Twitter are forced to open up their opaque rules on content moderation and data privacy. Conference, we will introduce a digital Bill of Rights, which will give everyone the right to free speech online, but just as importantly, to also give people the right to be free from online harassment and abuse. This is so important in allowing all of us to be able to participate in public debate. Many of us in this room have been victims of online abuse. Women and girls are routinely threatened with rape and sexual abuse for daring just to have a political opinion. Our own Jo Swinson received credible death threats requiring 24/7 police surveillance while she was Lib Dem leader. Ethnic minorities like Marcus Rashford are routinely abused, not just because they are Black, but because they have the audacity to be political. This is wrong. If we don't change our information ecosystem, Joe Cox and David Amos will not be the only MPs we will be mourning. A digital Bill of Rights will also ensure everyone can access the internet by providing a citizens' Wi-Fi service in public places so that everyone, rich or poor, can participate fully in online debate. This policy will also improve and simplify regulation by splitting Ofcom into two entities. One will ensure high-quality communications infrastructure, and the other will uphold our online rights and enforce protections from online harms. It will be genuinely independent of government interference. As part of this reform, we will also create a new expert communications court to provide oversight of the regulator's decisions so that social media users and companies will have the right to redress. As Liberals, we want to give citizens the tools to think for themselves, to make up their own minds. So our policies will create a healthier news environment and give citizens the tools to see through misinformation and disinformation. Borrowing from Finland, we will introduce new media literacy skills, not just at school, but throughout our lives, so that we can all acquire the skills to think critically about the media we're consuming. To encourage a more vibrant and financially sustainable model for journalists and media companies, we will also introduce a fact-checking and local journalism fund. This would be funded by a levy on social media companies. In doing so, we hope to revive local journalism and local reporting and improve political accountability in all our communities. Without proper scrutiny, democracy dies. Conference, we have all watched as Boris Johnson's government has undermined the foundations of our democracy. He has lied to the Queen, to Parliament, and to the public. He's used social media to amplify and reinforce his lies. The more outlandish the lie, the more anger it incites, the faster it spreads, and the more money Mark Zuckerberg makes. Unlike the Tories, we want to safeguard our democracy from corrupting influences, like Russian oligarchs, for example. The Tories want to undermine the Electoral Commission. We want to strengthen it with new powers to investigate electoral wrongdoing and to provide meaningful punishment when the rules are broken. We will also improve transparency in our elections by legislating for far greater openness in spending and online advertising, as well as giving citizens better tools to scrutinize and compare party manifestos. As a party that wants to partner as closely as possible with Europe, we will aim to agree a common position with the EU on antitrust issues concerning the social media giants and their use of data. Our aim here is to go back to being the active player we once were in setting standards across the continent. We will also help promote our liberal values and principles around the world by advocating for a new counter-disinformation treaty. This treaty would be supported by a fund to fight fake news. As we have seen in the Donbass and with the invasion of Ukraine, war is not just being fought with tanks and Stinger missiles, but also by bot farms in St. Petersburg. Conference, our ability to debate and engage politically is the foundation of our democracy. If we do not actively take steps to protect it, then who will? We need a new set of policies that will give us back the freedom to debate without fear or recrimination or censorship or control. Conference, please vote against the reference back and against the separate vote today, and please vote in favor of the motion as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Will James Bailey please stand by? And I now call Andrew Emerson from Shetland, who's speaking in favour of deleting lines 84 and 85 and against the motion as a whole.
Thank you. Please bear with me. I had only half drafted some words on this because I was not called until I heard my name being called earlier. So, conference, if you think yourself back to the heady time of conference last year, this motion was brought to us, and aims were generally lauded, but it's the words that were used for it, the actual substance of the motion were widely panned, and it's as a result it suffered a reference back. It's a shame that rereading this motion that I think many of those problems still exist, especially lines 84 to 85. Those are the lines that say, if I was to go and create a news blog tomorrow, post that link on Facebook for some free publicity, somehow then Facebook would owe me money. It's essentially a link tax that originated with Rupert Murdoch. Now, what this would essentially do is Rupert Murdoch can churn out all of the journalism he likes on his online social media, on his online website. You know, we've all searched for, is Tesco open on this bank holiday?
No, we don't.
And came across those kind of those really nonsense journalism pages that appear on The Sun and The Mirror and all of those sorts of things. But somehow by posting those to Facebook, Facebook would owe Rupert Murdoch money for those. I don't get it. I don't understand it. Now, they tried this in Australia, and Facebook simply shut down their feeds. Facebook simply threatened to shut down Facebook as a result. And yes, Facebook has a massive misinformation problem, and I'm not going to stand here and defend it as an institution, because there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that disinformation is counted on the site. But all that's going to result in is people consuming less good media and less media overall. And I can't see how that would be good for democracy or culture at all. So I would urge you to delete these lines, because there's no need to go down this pro-Murdoch route. If the party wants to flesh this idea out into a full motion, I would look at it and I would consider it to see if there was any safeguards in there. But as it stands, I think we should stand to delete these lines and support the motion as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and apologies that you weren't given the normal notice. Will Chris Adams please stand by? And I now call James Bailey from Breckland and South West Norfolk, who's speaking for the motion as a whole.
Thank you, John. As has been noted in Christine's excellent opening speech, I moved a referral back on this at the last conference, which conference accepted. The purpose of a referral back is for when conference believes that the fundamental thrust of a paper is correct, but there are issues with it, particularly issues in the technical detail of the paper itself. That's, if you like, that's what it's designed for. And that's exactly what happened here. That there were issues, they were noted in the opening speech, but to go over them again, I worked with the working group. As I said I would, we're moving the reference back. We improved the focus of who the proposals are aimed at, tightened up the definition of social media to stop these proposals potentially hitting smaller online outlets and ensure competition can take place. We also clarified, very importantly, that people's rights in online communities exist with regards to the rules those communities set, rather than sort of big top-down external legal precepts. We shouldn't be forcing any sort of company or community to host, for example, racist but technically legal speech. That's simply not a business the government should be in, and we have put that as effectively safeguarded in the new version of the paper. And we did important work when it came to tackling online abuse. Conference goers were very rightly concerned that new rights to challenge companies for failing to uphold free speech could discourage companies from tackling abuse. Now, the new version of the paper has a converse version of that right, such that people can challenge companies who fail to uphold their own safeguarding rules, and gives companies much more explicit safeguarding requirements on users. Whether or not you agree with all of the policy in the paper, they now form a sharp, effective platform and a liberal contribution to the public debate. There are areas of this we're going to keep revisiting, no doubt. This is a massive policy area. But I think it is important now that we move forward. I think we've now got an effective revised set of policies here that do what they say on the tin and are worded effectively. And I encourage conference to reject the reference back today and pass the motion in its new form. This is your win. This is the revisions that conference asked for last time. And I think that together we've produced a much more effective policy here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Will Lois Norton please stand by? And I now call Chris Adams, who's a member of the Policy Working Group, and he is speaking for lines 36 to 40.
Thank you very much, John. Good evening, conference. I'd like to associate myself a lot with much of what James has just said now. And actually, the lines that I'm speaking to, 36 to 40, relate directly to the Communications Court, which was an idea that I had put forward in the working group, which I had probably the most direct hand in developing. And that court provides judicial oversight. Now, as a working group, we really grappled with the problem of how we could develop a policy which both preserved freedom of speech and enabled us to crack down on abuse online and the spread of misinformation. Now, clearly that wasn't quite clear enough in the last motion that came to conference, and that's why we clarified it, but that was always the intention behind it. Perhaps the most controversial example we looked at when we were considering how to do this was Trump's Twitter ban. Now, as Liberals, relieved as we may have been initially when the Twitter ban came in, we were deeply uneasy about the fact that a platform like Twitter could effectively silence a prominent politician, and in this case, the leader of one of the most powerful countries in the world, without any form of oversight from anyone else. It's a real threat to freedom of speech. And the way that we looked at it was, what if one day they decided that, I don't know, Ed Davies' espousal of the liberalisation of cannabis should be seen as a threat to social cohesion, and therefore he needs to be banned from Twitter altogether. Well, that's a really serious issue for a political party. And should a private company really have the right to be able to do that? These are all really difficult questions. And similarly, maybe a different radical new liberal policy, which we haven't conceived of yet, could somehow, perhaps it would threaten that company's bottom line. And they would just think, oh, well, I'll just, stop them from speaking, even though I'm the person, the platform that hosts all of these debates. So there needed to be a check on that power. That said, it's also clear that regulators and even the police, unfortunately, don't have the capacity to take down harmful content at speed. Social media companies do. So as a working group, we decided there needed to be some sort of recourse beyond a company's internal policies, which could challenge this kind of decision, similar to a tribunal used in other settings. And that is the reason behind the Communications Court. It would be a specialist court with clerks and judges with a deep knowledge of this area of the law, who could accurately assess appeals and take appropriate action to hold social media companies to account and, where appropriately, order them to reverse decisions or even force them to take action where they'd failed to do so. It's a vital innovation that would end that regulatory wild west of social media, introduce a sheriff, if you will, to keep everyone honest, even the regulator. For that reason, and on that specific point, I urge you to support the motion. I'll also just quickly note on the reference back, James made a very good point about the purposes of a reference back. We'll see when we come to the vote, but I'm sure that conference will agree with me that the purposes given for the reference back for this motion do not apply in the same way. So please support the motion, vote against the separate vote and against the reference back. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Will M. Dean please stand by? And I now call Lois Norton from Bexhill and Battle, who is speaking against lines 32 and 101 to 113.
Hi, I'm an ancient retired IT person with a business applications background, and I'm a social media refusenik. I won't use any of the very large social media networks. Line 32 is about upholding the right to privacy online, but it seems to me that if you sign up to a supposedly free social network, you sacrifice your privacy because you have no real idea what is being done with your subscription, and your subscription is your personal data. My position is I won't sign up to any online product of any large organisation whose business model is based on backing up users' personal data, supposedly for no cost. I do not believe such organisations can be trusted. That includes Google, by the way. Lines 101 to 113 are about increasing competition and reducing concentration of power in the social media market. Admirable, but the genie's already out of the bottle. The small number of very powerful organisations, bigger than some countries' economies, are not going to let go. I have little faith in the chances of enforcing increased competition, especially when so many people who could have supported the competition in the past have taken the easy route, the dominating social networks. In our preamble, it states that none shall be enslaved by conformity. I get really cheesed off when party organisations push members in the direction of organisations such as Facebook and provide little or no other options for online party-related communications. For example, as a retired IT person, I'd be happy to be trying to help small local parties struggling to do even the basics with the party's campaign tools. But no way would I do so if I had to communicate via one of these large social networks. Consider it rather hypocrisy for people in the party to be pushing this communications route while this policy is being put forward. I suggest that party-related internal communications among members and staff, etc., should be addressed by the ongoing tech project after the immediate priorities of data integrity and websites have been addressed. I probably support this motion at the end of the day. I'm just not happy about my own rights to individuality and privacy being addressed properly.
Thank you, Lois. Will David Barnsdale please stand by? And I now call M. Dean from Harrow to speak for the motion as a whole.
Hello again, conference. I promise this is the last time you'll hear from me this weekend. And unbelievably, I'm speaking for something, so you know it must be good. I want to quickly just address what Lewis just said, because it's a topic which is very dear to my heart in sort of ownership of data and privacy online. And I respect these are very difficult things to do, and I respect that monopolisation is a dramatic issue. In fact, some people speaking against this motion last conference thought we took the antitrust stuff a bit too far. So I think that actually, you know, we give people ownership of their data in this motion. That's actually quite a radical thing, and something which I think we worked very hard on and was a great achievement of this motion. We also went further, I think, than some of the people in the working group wanted in actually ensuring anonymity could be preserved online. That's a bit of a risky choice because anonymity does allow certain shall we say, libertarian activities to continue. However, it does mean that there's important safeguards for individuals when they do sign up to these services, which I admit are quite scary. I don't trust them either, and I'm a inveterate social media user. So I hope nobody votes against the motion on those bases. I want to mostly talk about local news, though. My first job was as a reporter for a little regional newspaper in America called Hola America. It was in Spanish and English. And one of the best things about this motion, I feel, is its support for local news. I have a very lucky to live in an area with a strong, free local newspaper written by locals. I think there's about 2 or 3 of them involved. But it's great that we have that. It's not a member of any big consortium. It's just there to give us the weird local news of the day. We really need to protect things like that. It's very hard to do because it's reaching the point where they can't be more efficient than they already are. But a lot of people rely on this for their daily communication. A lot of people are not online. And this motion does a lot towards supporting that news and doesn't let it get swallowed up by the Murdochs of the world and the big companies. And I think that's excellent. Another thing, a great thing about this motion that I want to call attention to is the encouraging Creative Commons and shareable media and having financial support, direct financial support for people who are creating those community interest content. That's so very important to our news cycle. Please support this motion. Please do not support the removal of any lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Em. Will Lord Clement Jones please stand by? And I now call David Barnsdale from Kingston, who will be speaking against the motion as a whole.
First, there's some good things about this motion. It does recognise that a small number of social media companies are so dominant as to form the modern public square, and as such have special responsibilities. When a private company of the size of, say, Twitter excludes something from their platform, it is just as much an attack on free expression as an attack by a government. And the motion does recognise that social media companies often enforce their rules in a capricious way. However, throughout the policy paper is a belief that what is going wrong is social media in seeking engagement promotes division by feeding users provocative views. While there is some truth in that, the more serious problem is the way social media encourage us to gather into bubbles where we are cocooned with people who agree with us. That's why, when we briefly step out of our bubbles, we end up in shouting matches because we are relying on very different sources of information. The Communication Standards Authority that this motion sets up will oversee the terms of service of social media platforms. That is to say, the rules about what can be said on those platforms and on what basis people can be banned. Because of the focus on polarization due to clickbait media, the main effect of the changes in terms of services will mean more people getting suspended. And to be clear, this will, in the main, be for legal speech. The report does lay down more immediate action against illegal speech, but the social media companies will be expected to clamp down on legal expression of views as well. The motion claims that the CSA will be independent because it will be appointed by the Commissioner for Public Appointments, but this is giving a huge amount of power to this individual. And future governments are likely to be very concerned as to who is appointed. It is not likely to become a party appointment, but there is no guarantee they will be neutral. You may think that you don't post fake news, but who defines fake news? People in Russia are now facing long prison sentences for stating that the fake news that Russia is fighting a war in Ukraine rather than a special operation. You may think that you won't be affected because you don't express hate speech. Authoritarian governments have deemed socialism as to be stirring up class hatred and have been elastic about who they catch under that label. Have you never, while campaigning for the EU, been told that you hate Britain? We do not know what a future government will do with such a structure. Be careful about what you are opening the door to. Please vote against.
Thank you, David. Will Matthew Lewis please stand by for the reference back? And I now call Lord Tim Clement Jones, who is our digital spokesperson in the House of Lords.
Thank you very much, Chair, and congratulations to Christine for a great opening speech. Now, conference, as we saw from the debate last autumn, policy on public debate and free speech is a difficult one to get right, particularly online. And we have to make sure as a party that we find the proper balance between the right not to experience harm online and the right to freedom of expression. And I admit that none of us are going to agree with every single word of a policy document when the digital world is moving so fast. But this is a good motion and we need to make decisions. I spent 6 months of last year on the Joint Scrutiny Committee looking in detail at the government's flawed proposals for the regulation of online harms in the draft Online Safety Bill. And we heard evidence from a great number of witnesses about the grievous harms, such as revenge porn, cyber flashing, trolling, encouragement to suicide and racism, being experienced online, in particular by children and those with protected characteristics. And we also heard about the potentially dangerous impact of online platforms on our democracy in the way their algorithms and business models target messages, often extreme, using our own behavioural data. Frances Horgan, the brave former Facebook, now Meta employee, in particular, gave us a vital insight in the threats to our democracy from online mis- and disinformation and the platform's failure to take adequate action. The January 6th riot last year at the Capitol in Washington was fueled by social media. We now know the reality of Russian interference in presidential elections and the Brexit referendum via opaque social media accounts. People should have the same rights online as they have offline, and we must also recognise the unique dangers that online access sometimes poses. The Online Safety Bill is due to be published this coming week. The Elections Bill is going through Parliament. We have new digital competition law coming down the track. If we pass this motion today, it will give us a distinctive Liberal Democrat approach that we can be proud of. Our Digital Bill of Rights will set out the principles of the approach, in particular, the right to free expression and participation online without being subject to harassment and abuse, which should underpin our party and our society. And we must regulate so we ensure platforms comply with these principles, are audited for their policies and processes in terms of treatment of users and dissemination of illegal content, monitored on how they respond to infringement, and sanctioned for failure, with the Communications Court as a backstop. Media and digital literacy too, so strongly emphasised by the Democracy and Public Debate paper, is vital too. We need, as it says, to combat misinformation with critical thinking. Conference, this motion combines principles, regulation and education in the right proportion. Please back it overwhelmingly.
Thank you, Tim. Will Martin Dixon please stand by? Now, I've received a request for a reference back under Standing Order 11.2. It's from Matthew Lewis of Guildford. The request is to refer the motion back to Federal Policy Committee. There have been quite a few reference back requests this conference, but I'll explain the process anyway. I'll now read Matthew's statement of reasons, and then I'll ask you to vote whether or not you want to have a mini debate on whether we should refer the motion back. If you vote against, we'll proceed to the summation. If you do vote to hold a mini debate, I will call one speaker on either side of the argument. So will Matthew Lewis and Chris Adams please stand by to speak for and against the reference back, respectively. So here is the statement of reasons. Although the motion has improved since the version at a previous conference, there are still some drafting issues, such as lack of clarity on the legal meaning of the term ownership in this context, references to trademarks of private organisations such as Royal Mail and Kite Mark, and a reference to a specific technical standards brand Wi-Fi, not the more general concept of publicly available wireless internet access. So, conference, we'll now move to a vote in the polls tab of Hopin on whether to have a mini debate on whether or not to refer this motion back. Cara, please open the poll. Thank you, Conference. Well, that was a close vote. There were 93 votes in favour of a mini-debate and 102 votes against having a mini-debate. So Conference does not wish to hear a mini-debate. So I now call Martin Dixon, the Chair of the Policy Working Group, to summate for the motion.
Thank you, John. Conference, we've had a very good debate on one of the most important policy issues of the day. The very real threat to our democracy from the decline in the quality of public debate in this country and around the world. And as Christine Cheng pointed out, in moving the motion, the threat has been underlined afresh by Russia's horrific invasion of Ukraine. Lies and misinformation are the lifeblood of the Putin regime, and much of it has been directed at this country in recent years. Just look at Brexit. Yet, the threat is not solely from abroad. Britain is awash in homemade lies, many of them told by members of the current cabinet, misinformation and hate speech. And as Liberal Democrats, we urgently need a clear, coherent policy to combat this. Yet, this is an extremely complex and delicate policy area. We need to carefully balance our passion for free speech with the protection of the rights of the individual to privacy and freedom from harm. Striking the balance is hard. So it's not surprising that we've heard some dissenting voices during this evening's debate and in past discussions. Christine mentioned the referral back at last autumn's conference, and I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to the subsequent discussion, which has produced the more robust motion you see before you. In particular, I'd also like to thank James Bailey for his big input. Last autumn, James moved the vote to refer the paper back, so I'm delighted that this evening he's spoken in favour of the motion. As he says, this is a huge and rapidly changing policy area, which we'll have to come back to, but this gives a way of moving forward. I'd also like to point to Tim Jones's comments, and in particular his emphasis on this gives us an opportunity to create a distinctly liberal policy framework, just as the government's flawed online safety bill is coming back to Parliament. M. Dean, I think, replied to some of Lois Norton's concerns. The paper gives individuals more controls over their data than would otherwise be the case. And he also emphasised the importance of local news in this paper, which is a vital part of local democracy. Chris Adams, I think, very eloquently clarified the origins and workings of the proposed communications court, the creation of a new sheriff in town. But inevitably, there were some opponents to the motion. David Barnsdale spoke eloquently of his fears of a clampdown on legal expression of views and the danger of excessive powers to the regulator. Andrew Emerson spoke about the risks, as he saw it, of the Murdochization of the media under this proposal. I have to disagree. Some concerns were raised about this area at Autumn Conference, and we fleshed out the document to ensure that the framework doesn't have perverse outcomes, in particular entrenching the dominance of major news providers. Conference, to those who oppose this motion, I would say, please do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. To repeat what's been said before, we urgently need a coherent policy on public debate, and we need it right now, not after more months of discussion. We need it well before the next election. We need it this month while the Tory online safety bill is under discussion. Conference, in contrast to the Tory bill, our policy paper, underpinned by Liberal Democrat values, carefully balances free speech and individual rights. So please vote against the separate vote and for the motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Martin is a first-time speaker, as he didn't get the opportunity to speak last time. Apologies for a short technical problem during that speech, but I think you got the bulk of it. We now move to the final two votes that will take place in the polls tab in the auditorium. First, we'll take a vote on the separate vote on lines 84 and 85, which Andrew Emerson spoke requesting the deletion of. You can vote to delete those lines or to retain them. So Cara, please start the vote. You now have 2 minutes to vote. Thank you for voting, conference. There were 48 votes to delete those lines and 125 votes to retain them. So lines 84 and 85 are retained. So finally, we'll take a vote on the substantive motion as a whole. Cara, please can you start this final vote? And conference, you have 2 minutes to vote. There were 159 votes in favour and 33 votes against, so the motion is very clearly carried. Thank you to all the speakers in this very well-informed debate on a crucial topic for our society, and apologies to those who I was unable to call for time reasons. I'd also like to thank my aides Nick DaCosta and Cara Jenkinson and all the technical team from Vivid. So we've now reached the end of tonight's session. Conference reopens at 9:30 tomorrow morning for the emergency motion on the war in Ukraine. As this is a virtual conference, there's no Glee Club to go to on the Saturday night, but there is a discussion by Lib Dem Book Club in the Fringe, which is happening now. And I'm aware of physical social activities for those in York and London as well. So good night, conference.